In 1989, Susie Creek in northeastern Nevada was barely a creek at all. It was a thin ribbon of water slicing through bare gravel. No willows, no sedges, no shade. Just sun-baked dirt stretching to the horizon under a sky that rarely delivered rain. Nevada receives less than 10 inches of rainfall per year, making it the driest state in America. And Susie Creek looked the part, a scar in the desert where water once meant something. Then a handful of beavers showed up. Not imported by helicopter. Not part of some multi-million-dollar government program. They walked in on their own, drawn by changes so subtle that the ranchers who worked the land almost missed them. Within a decade, those beavers had turned a dead waterway into a lush corridor of green, with deep pools, thick willows, and nesting waterfowl right in the middle of a landscape where nothing was supposed to survive a historic drought. What happened at Susie Creek reads like fiction, but every piece of it is documented by the USDA Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and peer-reviewed science. And the method behind it is so simple, it almost sounds like a joke: mud and sticks. This is the story of how the most underestimated animal in North America is rewriting the rules of drought survival in the American West, and why scientists, ranchers, and government agencies are now racing to copy what beavers do naturally. But to understand why this matters, you first need to know what we lost. Before European settlers arrived in North America, an estimated 60 to 400 million beavers occupied the continent. That number is not a typo. At the high end, there may have been more beavers in pre-colonial America than there are humans living in the United States today. Their dams and ponds covered more than 300,000 square miles of wetland, roughly a tenth of the total land area, creating a vast, interconnected mosaic of slow water, rich soil, and thriving habitat for fish, birds, amphibians, and mammals. Then came the fur trade. Beginning in the 1600s, beaver pelts became one of the most valuable commodities in the global economy. European demand for beaver felt hats drove an industrial-scale slaughter that reshaped the politics of an entire continent. The Hudson's Bay Company alone shipped nearly 3 million pelts to England between 1853 and 1877. French and British traders pushed deeper into the interior, establishing trading posts that would become cities like Montreal, Detroit, and St. Louis, all built on beaver money. Wars erupted between indigenous nations over control of trapping grounds. By 1900, the beaver population across North America had collapsed to roughly 100,000 animals, from hundreds of millions to 100,000 in 3 centuries. The consequences were catastrophic, but slow enough that most people never connected the dots. Without beaver dams to hold water back, streams cut deeper and faster through the landscape. Floodplains dried out, water tables dropped. Wetlands that had stored billions of gallons of water simply vanished. Rivers that once meandered through networks of ponds and marshes became narrow, incised channels racing toward the sea. In the arid West, the damage was especially devastating. Streams that had sustained wildlife and vegetation for millennia turned into the barren, eroded ditches we now consider normal. What most Americans see when they look at a western creek, a thin line of water between bare banks, is not natural. It is the aftermath of beaver removal on a continental scale. And in places like Elko County, Nevada, where Susie Creek and Maggie Creek wind through 200,000 acres of ranch land, the erasure was total. In 1990, a young cowboy named John Griggs got hired at Maggie Creek Ranch in Elko County. One of his first assignments was to drive a load of dynamite back from Battle Mountain. His job? Blow up a beaver dam on Maggie Creek. The attitude among ranchers at the time was straightforward. Beavers were the devil. They dammed up irrigation ditches. They flooded grazing land. They were a problem to be eliminated with explosives. Around the same time, a Bureau of Land Management fisheries biologist named Carol Evans was looking at the same creeks from a completely different angle. Evans had spent her career studying riparian ecosystems across the Bureau of Land Management's Elko district, and what she saw alarmed her. Decades of unrestricted cattle grazing had stripped the creek banks bare. Riparian areas that should have been thick with willows and sedges were just patches of dirt. The streams were eroding, the water table was dropping, and native fish like the Lahontan cutthroat trout, Nevada's state fish, were running out of habitat. Evans approached Griggs with a proposal that was simple but radical for the time. What if the ranch just kept cattle away from the creek banks during the hottest months of the year? Not permanently, not with expensive fencing everywhere, just seasonal rest. Give the plants a chance to recover during the growing season, then graze again when the vegetation could handle it. Griggs was skeptical but agreed to try. The results were almost immediate. The first year, native grasses returned along the creek margins. The second year, wildflowers and other plants followed. By the mid-1990s, willow saplings had taken root. And then something happened that Evans herself had not predicted. It takes roughly 8 to 12 years to restore a riparian plant community to a level that can support beaver colonization. By 2003, beavers began showing up on Susie Creek and in the Maggie Creek watershed. They were not released or relocated. They walked in on their own, drawn by the recovering willows, their primary food source and building material. Griggs was not thrilled. His instinct, shaped by generations of ranching culture, was to reach for dynamite again. But Evans convinced him to wait. Let the beavers work. Wait. What happened next transformed the landscape in ways that no amount of human engineering could have achieved. The beavers built dams. Those dams slowed the water. The slowed water spread across the floodplain, soaking into the ground and recharging the underground aquifer. The raised water table fed more plant growth, which stabilized the banks, which trapped more sediment, which built the floodplain higher. A self-reinforcing cycle of restoration kicked in, driven entirely by animals working with mud and sticks. By 2006, a remote sensing survey counted 107 beaver dams along 20 miles of Maggie Creek. By 2010, that number had risen to 271. An 11-mile stretch of Susie Creek and roughly 16 miles of the Maggie Creek Basin were now populated with beaver colonies. Beaver dams spread across the landscape. And then the drought hit. The years following 2012 brought some of the worst drought conditions the region had seen on record. Neighboring ranchers were trucking in water just to keep their cattle alive. But on Maggie Creek Ranch, something remarkable was happening. The beaver-dammed sections of Susie Creek still had water. Deep, slow-moving pools persisted through the heat. Green vegetation lined the banks while the surrounding desert turned brown and brittle. Griggs, the man who once blew up beaver dams, became one of the most vocal advocates for beaver restoration in the American West. He went on to become president of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association and a speaker at environmental symposiums across the country. As he put it, most people think of a creek as just the water you can see, but a healthy creek is the water you can see, and a big sponge of water beneath it that hydrates the whole floodplain. Beavers, when they slow water down and back it up, hydrate that sponge. For ranchers, that means areas of green when nothing else is green. A 2015 photograph of Susie Creek, taken at the end of one of the region's worst 4-year droughts, shows a lush ribbon of wetland cutting through parched sagebrush. The contrast is so stark it looks manipulated. It is not. The Susie Creek transformation was dramatic, but for the scientific community, anecdotes are not enough. The question was whether beaver dams genuinely improve stream conditions in measurable, replicable ways, or whether Maggie Creek Ranch was a lucky outlier. The answer came from Bridge Creek, Oregon. Bridge Creek is a high desert stream in a semi-arid region of central Oregon that receives roughly 12 inches of rain per year, with barely an inch falling during summer. Baseflow discharge can drop as low as 0.05 cubic meters per second, essentially a trickle. Researchers from Utah State University and NOAA tracked beaver dam distributions and monitored water temperatures across 34 kilometers of stream for 8 years, from 2007 to 2014. During that period, natural beaver dams in the study area increased tenfold. The results, published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS One in 2017, revealed multiple mechanisms by which beaver dams regulate stream temperature. At the reach scale, the increased water storage behind dams buffered daily temperature swings, reducing dangerous highs and moderating lows. At the channel scale, enhanced groundwater connectivity created pockets of cooler water that functioned as thermal refugia for fish. In a warming west where stream temperatures are becoming lethal for native salmonids, these cold water refuges are becoming a matter of species survival. But the Bridge Creek study went further. The research team also installed beaver dam analogs, or BDAs, along 4 kilometers of stream. Beaver dam analogs mimic the function of real beaver dams. They are constructed from the same materials beavers use: untreated wooden posts driven into the stream bed, woven with willow branches, and packed with mud and sediment. A team of 3 or 4 people can build one in a few hours using hand tools. The cost per structure runs a fraction of what traditional engineered stream restoration demands, sometimes less than $1,000 per dam compared to tens of thousands of dollars per linear meter for conventional approaches. The BDAs performed. They slowed water, trapped sediment, raised the water table, and in several cases attracted real beavers who then took over maintenance and expansion of the structures. The study demonstrated that both natural dams and BDAs could be used to counteract the thermal degradation threatening temperature-sensitive species. This was the evidence the restoration community needed. Joe Wheaton's team at Utah State University published the Low-Tech Process-Based Restoration Design Manual in 2019, providing practitioners with field-tested guidelines for building BDAs and related structures. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released its Beaver Restoration Guidebook. The National Park Service began installing BDAs in places like Great Basin National Park. State wildlife agencies from Nevada to Idaho to Washington launched beaver-related restoration programs. The appeal is hard to overstate. Traditional stream restoration involving heavy machinery, engineered rock structures, and years of permitting can cost tens of thousands of dollars per mile and often fails within a decade when floods rearrange the engineered features. BDAs cost a fraction of that, use materials found on site, and are designed to be temporary. They do not need to last forever. They just need to hold long enough to kickstart the natural processes that beavers or the stream itself can then sustain. In Nevada, the State Department of Wildlife is now building BDAs across the Humboldt River Basin and actively working to re-establish habitat conditions that can support wild beaver populations. In Idaho, the technique has been deployed on Birch Creek and dozens of other rangeland streams. In Oregon, watershed councils and soil conservation districts have become intermediaries, helping private landowners navigate the permitting process for BDA installation. The skepticism has not disappeared entirely. Some researchers caution that beaver dam analog use is outpacing the monitoring data. Structures are going in faster than scientists can measure their long-term effects. Beavers themselves are not always easy neighbors. On Susie Creek, the expanding beaver population began consuming and drowning willows faster than the recovering plant community could sustain them. Evans noted that if another 5 to 10 years of regrowth had occurred before beavers arrived, the system would have been better equipped to support them. And in urban areas like Reno, beavers remain what they have always been to some people, a nuisance. But the trajectory is unmistakable. The cultural shift that John Griggs described, from viewing beavers as the devil to viewing them as essential infrastructure, is accelerating across the West. There is a photograph of Susie Creek, taken in September 1989. It shows a bare gravel bar with a thin line of water, no vegetation, no life, just erosion and dust. There is another photograph of the same spot taken in September 2015, at the end of a historic, punishing 4-year drought. It shows deep pools of clear water framed by dense willows, green grasses spilling across a wide floodplain, and waterfowl nesting in habitat that did not exist 30 years earlier. The only difference between those two images is that someone decided to let the plants grow back, and then someone decided to let the beavers stay. What makes this story extraordinary is not the technology. There is no technology. The tools are mud, sticks, and the instincts of a 30-pound rodent that has been engineering water systems for millions of years. What makes it extraordinary is the reversal, the moment when a rancher who once carried dynamite started carrying a message instead. The moment when a fisheries biologist proved that the cheapest and most effective restoration tool on the planet was already living in the watershed, waiting for an invitation. Across the American West, streams are drying. Aquifers are depleting. Wildfires are burning hotter and longer, in part because riparian corridors have lost the moisture that once acted as natural fire breaks. Native fish species are running out of cold water, and the solutions being proposed, massive desalination plants, engineered reservoirs, interstate water transfers, cost billions and take decades. Meanwhile, a beaver can build a dam overnight, for free. The lesson of Susie Creek is not that beavers are magical. It is that the systems they create, the slow water, the deep sponge, the expanding floodplain, are exactly what the driest landscapes in America need to survive what is coming. And for the first time in centuries, humans are starting to get out of the way and let them work. A dead desert creek, 5 beavers, mud and sticks. And 30 years later, a green ribbon of life cutting through one of the worst droughts in recorded history. That is not a fairy tale. That is documented science, and it is happening right now across the American West. But beavers are not the only animals rewriting the rules of ecosystem recovery. In our next video, we explore another species that was nearly wiped out, and whose return is transforming a landscape in ways scientists are still struggling to explain. You will not want to miss it.